My friends, it's a pleasure to be back with you today and to tell you a little more history of our very historical town, Bristol, Virginia, Tennessee. Some people have asked me why I became so interested in the history of Bristol. Very soon after arriving here, I began to hear stories about early Bristol, mainly because my first job here was in welfare work, and I had to go into the homes of some of the oldest people in town and talk to them, take their applications and look the situation over, so to speak. So I learned that they knew a lot about early Bristol. They were not original settlers, no indeed, but they were second generation pioneers. Some of them's parents actually came here in the very beginning. One man's life ran back to 1857, and he was almost to the beginning of Bristol, and he had some good early memories even of the Civil War. But he didn't remember right back to the very year it started. But what he didn't know, his father had told him. And I've got half of my book from him, my first book. Well, today I'm going to emphasize some of the things that are visible that pertain to early Bristol history. Souvenirs, things that remind us of those early days. I have been blessed to know so many of these old people, and so many of them have turned things over to me that they treasured for years and yet knew that the end was coming, and so they entrusted them to me. I consider it a very good trust. Thankful that they would do such. And by the way, out there, if you're in the same situation and need to do something about what you have that pertains to Bristol history, I'll be happy to advise you on what to do. I don't mean to tell you that I'll be asking you for it, but I just can advise you on what to do about these things. I do very often get requests for that kind of advice. Now then, this is just kind of a collection that I've chosen today. Pleasant Hill is almost a museum. It's a lived-in museum. When you open the door here and come in, you step back 100 years in time. The furnishings and everything are deliberately tried to furnish it that would match the period in which it was built. Some things are much older in the house, some things are a little younger. Some things date back to the 1700s, but not many in here. But I've chosen just to show you some of the things that when we have open house tours here, and that's very often through warm weather, things that you might see. If you take a slow tour, when I can pull drawers open and show you some of the things, not just a general tour of the house. What would you think an old black apron would mean? It's silk, very, very slickish to the feel. It pertained to, I won't say a famous woman, but an infamous woman in town. There's been a lot of talk lately, I get more interest in that nearly than anything, about the site of the Cameo Theater. That theater is located where once stood the largest brothel in Bristol. And it also had a madam that was such a legendary figure that people still inquire about her. And not only that, but there have been many tales, people claiming that they have actually seen this woman again, that she has appeared as a ghost, even in broad daylight, down walking the streets in front of this Cameo Theater. And I gave such a detailed description of her in my book that people recognize her when they see her. She always went dressed in jet black, skirts that swept the sidewalks as she walked along. She had some kind of a headdress. Some people could not describe it, but they said it's more like an old stovepipe bonnet. And what they meant by stovepipe bonnet was you have to look up it to see any face, and in that case you could hardly see her face. Her name was Pocahontas Hale. But in time she grew older and older and finally became incapacitated to where she needed a place to spend her last days. Very few people would have even thought about taking her into their homes, but one couple did. one of the girls who had been, shall we say, an employee in her establishment had gotten a husband there, married pretty well off here in Bristol, and she was living in a nice home at the time. I could tell you where and all, but that would be giving you too much information. But anyway, they took her into the home, and she died there eventually. And her clothes were left. Now, she always wore an apron over her black dress skirts, had long skirts that dragged the ground, but she always wore this black apron. Now, she also had a black shawl that she put around her shoulders all the time. Winter and summer, she wore that. And they had that, but they had also taken one of the grandmothers into the home, and the grandmother needed the shawl, and so they let her wear it out. All they had left of her clothing was the old black apron that she wore. Her establishment was known as the Black Shawl. That's because she always wore one around her shoulders. She claimed to be an Indian, but no one ever knew for sure. Some people thought she was a man dressed as a woman, but no one ever knew that for sure either. So this is all that remains of Pocahontas Hale in Bristol. When she died, the East Hill Cemetery was under the governing board of some of the very elite ladies of the town, and they would not hear to her being buried among what they call the just and righteous people. Truthfully, there were some people buried up there as worse than her, but I guess they didn't know that. And so she had to be buried in the Black Cemetery, Flat Hollow Black Cemetery. When that cemetery was moved to what's now the end of Piedmont, known as the Citizen Cemetery, she rests somewhere in that cemetery. I don't know just where her grave is located. Today, I will just get your curiosity up. Who do you suppose ever used that walking cane? That'll be the first article talked of in the next part we have of the show. I'll be back in a moment. In 1990, as I've said, I cleaned out an old house on King College Road. There's an old hall tree in the hall of that house, and in it was some old umbrellas and walking sticks and canes and things like that. Riding crop, which I do have that too out there in the hall. They told me about this before I ever saw the box marked the Andrew Johnson collection. They said that belonged to great-grandfather. Johnson wasn't their great-grandfather, but we'll get the rest of the story. Andrew Johnson was a close friend of their great-grandfather. He had made clothing for him when he was a tailor in Greenville, Tennessee. He made his wedding vest, which I had at one time, but I let the museum at Tazewell, Virginia have it, and it's on display there now. I do have a vest that he made, but not the one that he wore to his wedding. So he would come by and see these folks once in a while when he happened to be passing through the country. He was a budding politician then, had already been in office, not president of course, but in some offices. In 1859, he happened to show up at the house one day. He'd ride his horse from here up the way and ride the stagecoach at other times. Some way he came to Paperville, where this family lived, near Paperville. And he didn't know it, but he arrived on Mr. Bushong, the great-grandfather's birthday. Well, he wanted to give him a gift, but he didn't have but one thing he could give. In those days now, this was before he was president, remember, young men, I have pictures right here in the drawers in this room, of young men who at 20, 21 didn't think they were fully dressed until they had a walking cane in their hand. I've got a picture of a man about 19 years old here. He has his best suit and his bow tie, and he has a walking cane. That doesn't mean he needed it, but he had it as an article of dress. So it was with Andrew Johnson. He had this for an article of dress. He said, well, I have nothing else to give. I will give you my walking cane for a birthday present. And he said, I added, it's kind of probably a prophetic statement that we wouldn't want to hear. He said, I think you'll need it before long. It was his 50th birthday. And in those days, they considered a man 50 years old just about dead old. Well, the truth is, Philip Bushong didn't need it because he died in 2 years. And the cane was left with his widow. They always treasured it, passed it from one generation to the other. And finally it got down to the 3 grandchildren, none of whom had ever married. And they wanted it sure cared for. They said, now we're not going to let you sell that at all. You take it to your house, and if we never call for it, it's yours. I use it a little bit when I'm kind of weak in my legs, but I'm afraid to carry it around much because I'm afraid I'll leave it somewhere. I can't keep gloves, umbrellas, nor hats. I'll leave them lying somewhere and maybe never remember where they are. So I do show it today to you. It's a highly treasured article of mine. Johnson, you know the rest of the story. Johnson went on to be president. One afternoon, as I think I've previously told you, I went out there and found a box marked the Andrew Johnson collection, hidden away in a little old room halfway between floors. They call it a baggage room. And I opened it, and there were several things pertaining to a post-war visit that he made to the home after he was president. He came to their home to visit. The widow was there and her daughter was there, and they had some servants, of course. They invited him to stay for lunch. Well, of course, it was customary for a person to wash their hands before they sat down to eat. They had a water bench, they called it, outside. So before he came, they had the servant to hang up this towel, which the former president could use to dry for drying his hands. Now, I don't see how he did it because the material is very hard, and you can't call it absorbent at all. It's woven material. They told me it was woven by slaves before the war, made of flax, and it's very stiff and hard. But that was their towel. You can even see the loop that they put it on the nail above the wash bowl. And he washed his hands and dried it. They immediately laundried it, put it away in the box, would never use it again. It was part of their souvenir. He ate dinner with them that day, lunch I guess you'd call it to be more correct. And this is the plate from which he ate. I'll take this out where you can maybe see the pattern in it. I had it marked. It is an old plate, very old English pattern. And they treasured the fact that he had eaten from it. They practically worshiped it, even though they were strong Confederates and he was a Union. They practically worshiped the man. And when the lunch was over, he was gone. She only had one daughter, the widow did. She told the daughter, there were 6 of these plates, she told the daughter to take the other 5 and go to a neighbor's house and give them to him. Of course, she didn't want to get it confused. She didn't want to lose track of the one that he actually, from which he ate. So they saved the plate all these years, and it was in the box. I don't know what happened to his knife, if he had one. That's the fork, old-time pattern. They're very much sought after now, and that's the spoon. But there was no knife, and I asked them about the knife. She said, I don't know. We thought it was in there, but evidently it got lost out some way or another. Well, when you're entertaining royal company, so to speak, you always like to serve the best. But after the war years, the country was destitute, and on the place was left one old goose. Luckily, Andrew Johnson liked baked goose. And Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Dryden Bushon did kill the old goose, all the fowl that was left on the place. She later told the president, or ex-president, that she was serving him the best goose on the place. She didn't tell him it was the only goose on the place. He delighted and ate a big helping of it, I'm sure. Across their old table, I don't have the table, unfortunately. It was taken by one of the nieces or nephews or something. But this is the cloth that covered the table. It too was made, they said, by slaves before the war. And this is the napkin which he used. All of this was put in the box called the Johnson Collection. And she served the goose. Now, in the antique trade, these are called gaudy platters. That's the way they're identified. But gaudy platters or not, they're still sought after collectors. It's made in England, the marks on the back of it, made in England long ago. Real strong, heavy pottery. But that is what they serve the only goose on the place, the best goose on the place on. So those things, in a long tour here, they're shown. Now in quick tours, you don't get to see these things. They're stacked away, put away, but you out there in viewing land can see them today. I kind of think it's pretty, but the way they designate them in the antique market, if you read something for sale called a gaudy platter, that's one of them. It's made by some company in England a long time ago. Well, folks, that's about all I can tell you or show you right now, but there will be other times when I'll tell you more. Until we meet again, may the best in life be yours.